atomic bomb. This is Dane.
Amateur historian and political scientist by trade.
Absolutely. Okay. So thank you for speaking with us today, Dane.
I love history. Anytime, Juliet.
Excellent. All right. How did the Cold War begin, in your opinion?
Well, it's difficult to actually pinpoint a date in which the Cold War began. I mean, we could go ahead and, probably a pretty good event would be, obviously, the World War II has fallen on two fronts, Europe and the Pacific, all the way up to Japan. If we had to choose an exact point, I'd say when we nuked Japan. But, with the Yalta meeting that we had and whatnot, the United States throughout its history has always decided to side with the lesser of the two evils if it was necessary. So we knew the Soviets were kind of up to no good to begin with. So I think that we were thinking that they were our next enemy because of, well, there's a number of factors. But yes, as Jacob Harris stipulated, I do agree that probably the biggest event that would signify the beginning of the Cold War would be the dropping of the atomic bombs, as it were.
All right. So who did we drop the bomb on?
We did indeed drop the bomb on Japan. It happened in the summer because, America had participated in two battles. They aided Europe in dealing with Nazism, and they also fought their way up the Pacific and liberated various coastal places as a response to Japanese aggression. And we ultimately dropped the bomb because we developed the technology after VE Day, and it was ready to go. And, that's how it took place.
Would you like to elaborate on VE Day?
That was the day in which the fall of the Nazi regime was sought, and it was very widely celebrated in Europe because Hitler was just quite the brutal fellow. Not to say Stalin or any of his buddies weren't, but damn it, Hitler, bad news. Didn't by comparison kill as many as Stalin, but that's a story for a different day, as I'm sure you're well aware.
Thank you, Dane. All right, and what role did communism play in the Cold War and the atomic bomb?
Well, you could say that, capitalism and communism do not mesh. Many of their ideologies do not mesh. Collectivist kind of society versus, rugged individualism, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, you can make as much money as you want, rags to riches, etc., etc. But I think it was just names ultimately. I don't really think that even though there were aspects of communism, they really didn't enact any kind of communist government. It was basically, in my historical opinion, just a dictatorship that was, taking over lesser nations, not lesser in a pejorative sense, but basically, I think we just had two struggles for power, it's just kind of how it works. I don't, quite frankly, think that, other than it being a name, the fact it was communism versus capitalism really played a big role. I think it was just two world powers vying for world power. Hegemony, if you will. It's a good word.
Great word.
Great word.
All right, and what time period did the Cold War take place in?
Well, you could go ahead and say, again, we would definitely have to say that as soon as World War II was over, we were on to the next big thing, was how do we divide up that piece of the pie that's Germany, what happens to Poland. Hitler had pushed, being the evil bastard he was, pushed all the way into Europe, into Russia to the east before they repelled him, and we kind of got a nice pincer thing going. And Russian losses from fighting the Nazis were devastating. So to some extent, they were basically like, hey, we lost people, we lost resources. This is ours. This is our conquered nations. They didn't really call them that, but that's what they were. Sorry, what was the question?
The question was what time period?
Oh, yes. My apologies. So you could go ahead and say that the Cold War essentially ended when Ronald Reagan declared, Mr. Gorbachev, I impose you to tear down this wall. That was more or less the symbolic ending of it, but, there was still issues. There still are today. There's a bunch of nukes that aren't accounted for, but I'd say that the fall of the Berlin Wall, thus, liberating the Eastern Berliners from their family, I believe that was the symbolic moment that concluded the Cold War, in so few words, as it were.
All right, well, thank you. That was a little bit more than the question asked for, but that's great, thanks.
Historians like to elaborate. It's important the truth be told.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. Okay, so what kind of propaganda arose from the dropping of the atomic bomb and the Cold War, in your opinion?
Okay, well, if we want to go with the dropping of the atomic bomb, and people do it in war all the time, we portray our enemies as savages, barbarians, less than humans, In the Japanese case specifically, there was definitely the racial element. I mean, probably a popular example is Dr. Seuss drew some pretty unflattering caricatures of Japanese people just because we're killing them. We need to feel like righteous about it. What was the question? Sorry.
Propaganda.
I just get so excited. Okay, yes. So that would be the first instance, is we use propaganda to make the Japanese seem like less than human. Another good example, my fellow historical colleague Jake Harris mentioned the McCarthyism. I mean, that was just, more political maneuvering. And actually on that note, and it eludes me which president it was, but one buzzword that they loved to use was missile gap. The notion that the Soviets, those Reds, were catching up with us in missiles, and that was a concern. Kind of a moot point, because everyone had more than enough missiles to destroy the world 50 bazillion times over. But it was more or less a maneuver to make the other side look weak on defense. And again, I forget the gentleman who was making a run for president who made the accusation, but the standing president showed him, no, we have way more missiles because we're rich and capitalist. But it was definitely a good example of propaganda. I would also, and some of my colleagues have slightly disagreed, and it's a little bit more of a reach, but I feel that the Warsaw Pact was actually an instance of propaganda in the Cold War, because with NATO and the European Union, it was democratic nations willingly joining one another to, for fear of Soviet aggression. Versus the Warsaw Pact, which was more or less a response to that. It would be a joke to say everyone willingly made an alliance because they're worried about Western aggression. It was Russia and all of its conquered neighbors. Forced into this treaty. I think it was personally just kind of a joke. Another, I think, good example, and this is one, if you talk to people who were around back in the day, it really stuck with them, and in a lot of ways people have said it lost him the campaign. Goldwater was a very militaristic gentleman making a run for the presidency, and there was this very iconic commercial in which, political ad, in which a little girl is counting down in a girl voice, and then it goes to 10, 9, 8, and then missiles are launching. And the point, it was just a brief ad or a brief campaign thing, and it only ran a couple times, but the point was very clear, which is we are going to nuke the hell out of each other if this crazy Goldwater bastard gets in office. And that was another great example of propaganda being used in order to propagandize the Cold War. Next question.
Great. All right. Why do you think that we dropped the atomic bomb?
An interesting question. I think there's really a number of schools of thought. First off, World War II, there was no Hitler was kind of kicking some ass, and especially the Japanese caught us unaware and devastated our navy. They definitely also mobilized they got us going in a lot of ways, lit our fire, if you will. But the question, why did we do it? Well, the Japanese, and maybe again, I was speaking earlier of propaganda. There was also the propaganda Japanese had that the Americans were barbarians and we were going to rape them all and stuff. So they were fighting us to their last man. They would not. There was no surrender. It was some brutal stuff. And we had taken over various islands, and it had been just absolutely brutal combat. So we get to the mainland, still have forces, still entrenched. Any kind of land-based assault is just going to devastate U.S. lives. So one school of thought, and FDR was president for most of World War II, and then Truman became president, and he was, I think honestly Truman, because his call, I think it was to save American lives, because we lost no American lives in attacking the mainland of Japan that I'm aware of anyway, versus the massive casualties. And furthermore, there is actually the ethical question, as they had fought us down to their last man, would they do the same thing on the mainland? The packet I reviewed, which is, it's a very fair point, it's possible that we did kill more people than had we just invaded them, but a little speculative in my opinion. And lastly, I feel, as again my colleague Jacob Harris pointed out, we did it to show the Soviets, because we knew they were an emerging threat. We have devastating technology. This is not some hypothetical. We will wipe you off the face of the earth if you cross us. And we kind of did the same thing in the Berlin airlift. But that wasn't your question. My apologies.
That's all right. Thank you very much, Dane.